Many of his relatives, advisors, and so on have been killed in recent months, have been assassinated by the Taliban and their allies. Just last week, former president, who was the leader of the Peace Council, was assassinated by a suicide bomber in his own house. This is the reality of what's going on there, and these are things which are swept under the carpet by the British media in particular, and by the politicians who, very few of whom seem to know or care what is going on in Afghanistan. It's important, I think, therefore, that we recognise how badly this war is going, and how it cannot result in any serious victory. I noticed that in Libya, I don't really have time to talk much about Libya, but I noticed that in Libya they're declaring victory already, even though there's still bombing going on Sirte. Gaddafi supporters are still there. Now, I don't for a minute think that Gaddafi can re-establish control or anything like that, but I would caution the British government that actually they said exactly the same about Afghanistan. John Simpson from the BBC rode into Kabul on a tank to tell everybody that it was liberated and that was the end of the war. That was nearly 10 years ago when he did that. We were told the same in Iraq, where the photo opportunity was pulled down Saddam Hussein's statue, was heralded as this was the end, and George Bush mission accomplished, all these sorts of things. I believe in Libya there has been regime change, there will be regime change. I don't believe this is the end of the fighting or the end of the instability. Two just very quick points I want to make before I conclude. One is that I think that this whole war, leaving aside the whole military and related questions, I think it is an absolute insult to the idea that we live in a democracy that repeatedly opinion polls show a majority of public opinion in this country and the United States quite heavily against these wars and wanting the withdrawal of troops either immediately or rapidly, within the space of a few months. And I think it's an absolute travesty of democracy that we had the biggest demonstration ever against the war in Iraq, ever in this country, and that the politicians could not even then listen to what was clearly the expression of majority opinion. Absolutely final point is the cost of this war. Figures came out this week, which were very authoritative to me, by a guy called Francis Tusa, who looked at the cost of the war in Libya over the last few months. He put that down at 1.75 billion and rising. This compares with George Osborne's completely invented figures a few months ago that the cost of the war would be tens of millions. I mean, that was almost ridiculous. But the bombings have gone on much longer than they thought. The British are carrying out a fifth of all the airstrikes in Libya, and therefore that cost alone, and that doesn't include the bombings of the last couple of weeks, that cost alone will come to at least 2 billion for the immediate cost of the war. We know that Afghanistan is costing between £4 and £5 billion a year. And these are costs which don't take into account, for example, people who are injured and need caring for the rest of their lives, people who are disabled, people who might have mental illness as a result of fighting in these wars, and all the other things that we know are relatively common, unfortunately, are common features of war. So it does seem to me a remarkable thing that we have a government which is addicted to war. David Cameron seems to think it's a great advance for him to be so involved in the Libya war. They're addicted to these wars. They're addicted to things like the nuclear weapon system, Trident, and so on, which was designed for a very different time, a very different political and military situation in the world. And yet, at the same time, and all of you will know this, that when it comes to welfare, when it comes to education, when it comes to any of the health, any of these areas, we're told there isn't the money for any of these things. And it seems to me, again, an absolutely gross abuse of power, really, that there is limitless money for war and there isn't the money for these very, very basic welfare and building society, and not just building society here, building society in Afghanistan. How much better the Afghan people would be if the money that had been spent on war had been spent on aid that could have gone into education and agriculture and development and the things that people in that country really need. So those are the main points I want to make as to why I think that the troops should withdraw, why I think there has to be a political settlement. They're already talking to the Taliban, and this is something which will continue because they have no choice but to talk to the Taliban. And this is exactly the process that happens in Ireland, that happens in many, many countries, that people become terrorists. Nelson Mandela was famously described by Margaret Thatcher as a terrorist, and you know, who really has higher standing now on the world stage? And it's really very little contest in most people's minds as to that. And therefore terrorism in one age becomes the political settlement of the next age, and this will be the situation in Afghanistan if the Afghans are given the chance to be able to at least decide for themselves who runs their country, how it's run, without the interference, particularly of the old imperial powers, particularly of Britain and the United States and all these other powers. So it's for all these reasons I think that I don't think anything good has come out of war. I think a great deal of harm has come out of it. And I think for these reasons we need to get the troops out.
If I sit down, it's because at my advanced age, and my glasses won't let me read what I've printed.
Do sit down.
If that's all right with you, I'll try to disappoint those of you who thought you've got a steely-eyed killer to shout at. Just before we start, there was, of course, a time when 40 houses a day were being raided in Texas. First by Santa Anna and the Mexicans, and then secondly by the victorious North after the American Civil War. But anyway, moving on from that. As Lindsay's very kindly said, soldiers don't need any advice on the stupidity of war. It's a damn silly way of doing business. Most professional soldiers realise that very early on. Can you hear me, by the way? I put out 9 crosses every year for friends who were involved in various peacemaking or peacekeeping ventures, and there's a heavy price to pay. Nor do most of the military carry any great admiration for politicians after whom you clear up. I've seen it both from the military side and then the sort of bridge between military and civilian side with the UN, and then of course when I was in the Foreign Office I saw it, and I was quite often briefing ministers and chairing conferences at Wilton Park, which is the Foreign Office's Conference Centre, where you got to see these people firsthand. And, well, I'll say no more about that. But we are where we are. But neither is the world peopled anywhere else by nice people. Nor should you believe that the rich have a monopoly on evil or greed, or that the poor have a monopoly on goodness and morality. Bad people can, perhaps unintentionally, be a force for good. And good people can be responsible for terrible, terrible harm. I only learnt the title of this debate from the website this afternoon, just before I left. So I wasn't entirely sure which war it was you were trying to stop, or whether the argument was for war in general. Most soldiers would certainly agree with that. I've spent my life being involved in real counterinsurgency. That was a place called Dhofar, which very few of you will have heard of, I suspect. Conventional war, being involved in the Falklands, and what is ironically in the army often called peacekeeping, although where very often there's no peace to keep. And that brings you into contact with people you would not normally meet in the normal line of the military. There was a joke in Bosnia, in all sides in that conflict, and it was a much more complicated conflict than ever got reported, and that's something we as the military failed to do. We failed to get people to understand how complicated these situations are. But there was a Bosnian joke, which was shared by the Croats and the Serbs, that to actually make sure that the military got out and the politicians from the rest of the world came in to help, all they had to do was find oil. There may be some truth in that. But when I found out the title, What Have We Gained from 10 Years in Afghanistan, I asked myself, who's the we? The question should be, in my mind, what have the Afghans gained from 10 years of this? Something I tell my students is to beware of the arrogance of the West. It's a term I use, and I don't know whether I invented it or I heard it from somebody else. I haven't heard it anywhere else. But with my students, I say, beware of intellectual colonialism. The idea that you can go in somewhere with an answer, and this answer will solve their problems. It's just like, to me, the missionaries going in and saying Christianity will sort you out. So beware of intellectual colonialism, and we're all guilty of it. I saw it at first hand in Bosnia, and I'm sorry I'm broadening this, but I think it's important. I saw the arrogance of the aid agencies. When I was asked on German television, after I came back from Bosnia, what I thought we'd done right and what we'd done wrong, and frankly, Bosnia was a nightmare. The mission was not the right mission. We didn't even have the equipment and the power to carry out that limited mission. And yet we were suddenly trying to solve a problem that the people there couldn't solve themselves. But that's beside the point. I said there were two things we'd failed to do. We had failed to get all three of the main